In the 9th century, the weakness of the Bulgarian prince Boris I had allowed the small and insignificant Principality of Great Moravia to greatly expand, taking important salt mines in the Pannonian Basin in cities such as Solngrad, Zemlingrat, Bihar, and Svanik. At that time, the Magyars had only arrived to southwestern Ukraine the past 100 years, served as mercenaries for both the Bulgarian Tsardom and the Principality of Great Moravia. On one of the many occasions in which the Magyars would be hired, they would fight themselves fighting against the Bulgarians once again, only for the Bulgarians to make an alliance with the Pechenegs, who would raid the Hungarian homeland. Not only would the Magyars be defeated, but when they would go back home, they would discover that the majority of their women and children would be taken. Having recently helped the Great Moravians clear out the Pannonian Basin, they would decide to settle within the area, establishing a powerful kingdom that would last almost 1,000 years without any kind of major territorial changes. The mountains surrounding the basin served for a strong homeland for the Hungarians. They would soon annex Slovakia, while the Czech part of Great Moravia would become the Principality of Bohemia and leave the Union. Had the Bulgarians never hired the Pechenegs to attack the Magyar homeland, this would have never happened. Instead, the Magyar army would have returned peacefully into the area, at least for the time being. This would have allowed Tsar Simeon of Bulgaria to establish several buffer zone principalities in the Pannonian Basin, mostly around Transylvania. Magyars would be bribed by the Roman Empire to attack the Bulgarian Tsardom in the late 1900s, just like how in our own real timeline the Kievan Rus was bribed to attack them. With the Kievan Rus Prince Sviatoslav desiring to turn the Bulgarian province of Scythia Minor into the main province of the Kievan Rus due to its fertility and how heavily settled it was, turning the Bulgarian capital of Preslav into the new capital of the Kievan Rus. However, the Romans would defeat him and drive him further north. In this timeline, the Magyars would play a similar role. Having even a larger army than the Kievan Rus, they would take Scythia Minor for themselves. Magyars would have adopted the Bulgarian title of Tsar, however they would have had two Tsars instead, the first obviously being Arpad and the second being Kurzan, who was essentially the Kafkan or the general of the Magyar people. The Magyar at the time used a dual monarchy system. Despite this, however, the Magyars would have more than likely remained pagan. While on the other hand, Great Moravia's fate would have been solidified. There would be no nomadic power which would have settled in the Pannonian Basin and had taken its place, with Great Moravia capturing Belgrade. A large portion of the Bulgarian nobility in Ohrid and the personnel of the Ohrid Church would have traveled to Great Moravia, where in the city of Buda they would continue to write in Cyrillic and continue to spread it. Due to this, Great Moravia would have claimed itself as the successor of the Bulgarian Tsardom. It's also more than likely that the language spoken by the Slovenian Severians and the Seven Slavic tribes heavily influenced the language of Great Moravian, adopting more O's and A's instead of the ich in others that the Serbians have, for example. The Magyars' control over Romania wouldn't last for very long. The Pechenegs would soon migrate into the area and have clashes both with Moravia and the Magyar Tsardom. But now the Magyars would have established a firm control over Scythia Minor, intermixing with the local Slavic and Roman population. This would make the Magyar Tsardom heavily populated and would allow it to soon after stabilize. This Magyar Tsardom's emphasis wouldn't be on conquering Eastern Roman Empire land like the emphasis of the Bulgarian Tsardom under Simeon. Instead, it would be like the emphasis of Bulgaria before it became a Tsardom, that is to protect its own population, whilst at the same time the Principality of Raskia would become a Magyar vassal state. It is very likely throughout this time that the papacy and the West would start to refer to the Magyars as Hungary, especially considering that this used to be the territory of the Bulgarians, and Bulgari and Hungary sounds very similar. Meanwhile, the Magyars and Great Moravia would have formed an alliance against any migrating semi-nomadic peoples from the steppes. similarly to how the Bulgarians used to protect the Roman Empire against nomads. Soon the Czech lands of Great Moravia would find themselves increasingly distant from the main government in Buda. With the influence of Poland, the Principality of Bohemia would soon be formed and lead the Union around the 1100s, establishing itself likely as a dual monarchy of sorts. A brief period of peace would exist throughout the 1100s, all until the arrival of the Cumans, who would serve a crucial role. Being mercenaries all across the Balkan Peninsula, they would insert themselves in the politics of the Magyars and Great Moravia. One of their first major moves would be the destruction of the Pechenegs Khanate. Many of the Pechenegs would flee to what were known as modern-day Transylvania, where they would settle and cause trouble for the main government of Great Moravia. They would pillage towns in the main Pannonian basin while retreating to the mountains in the Carpathian. This soon would allow for the region to rise with its own independent identity. However, for now, these Pechenegs would be accepted by the Tsar in Buda, who would have used them to attack the Cumans, as well as protect the borders with Poland and Czechia. Just like in our own timeline, the Cumans would also play a crucial role in the election of the Tsar of the Magyars. In our own timeline, the Cumans played a crucial role in putting the three Asem brothers on the throne of the Bulgarian Tsardom, those being Kalyan, Belgun, Sen. In this timeline, they would put another one of their dynasties on the Magyar throne, greatly influencing the politics and the direction of the Magyar realm. Further clashes would have also continued, as the Cumans would have caused general trouble for Great Moravia, destroying and pillaging villages and cities, especially throughout the border. This would make the Danube River the main protection against the Cumans, and one of the most fortified regions in all of Europe during this time. But the Cumans would quickly be replaced by the Mongols, who would have arrived from the steppes and have caused complete chaos throughout the region. Just like in our own real life, the Mongols would end empires that had existed successfully for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Mongols would have vassalized the majority of Eastern Europe, burning and pillaging, expecting tribute. The Magyars in Great Moravia, however, would be able to make a substantial resistance. Although Great Moravia would have survived, would have been fractured. For the next 100 years, there would have been a civil war throughout the region. There would be a despotate of the Banat, a despotate of Slovakia, a despotate of Balaton, among many others, until eventually the despotate of Slovakia would have united the Pannonian basin. Somewhere around the 1300s, the despotate of Slovakia would have become known as the Tsardom of Slovakia, while a small principality would be formed which would be called Gorica. This would have been taken from the Bulgarian language, where in Bulgarian Gora means forest instead of mountain, referring to the very forested region of the Gorica Principality. There also would have been multiple attempts by the Tsardom of Slovakia to conquer the Principality of Gorica. However, bolstered by the Turkic peoples living within the area, this would not be possible for the time being. On the other hand, the Serbs, who have long since been enslaved by the Magyars, would be able to establish their own powerful Tsardom and rule the majority of the Western Balkans, including most of Greece. Ottoman expansion within the area, however, would be halted, with a much more powerful Serbia and Magyar Tsardom, which was heavily more centralized around the city of Buri. The Ottomans would have found it difficult to expand into the Balkans, at least for the time being. Throughout this time, Slovakia would experience a period of recovery and prosperity. Eventually, the Renaissance would have reached Slovakia from Italy, with Slovakia becoming the first realm to adopt the Renaissance ideas, similarly to how Hungary did in our own timeline. Slovakia would start to build some beautiful Italian Renaissance-style architecture within its cities. It would even become the first European power to start using gunpowder, and it would lend these gunmen to the other Balkan countries so they could protect themselves against the Ottomans, further slowing their advance into the Balkan Peninsula. And soon, with the increasing weakness of the Duchy of Croatia, Slovakia would be able to annex it, establishing a coastline on the Adriatic Sea for the first time. This would have resulted in Slovakia to attack the Gorica Principality, feeling confident that they could annex it. However, this yet again would fail, with the Slovak Tsar dying and being replaced by his younger brother. However, luckily for Slovakia at the time, there wasn't any major power that sought out to exploit it. Poland was too busy fighting its own civil war, while the strong Lithuania, which was kind of nearby, was too busy fighting the Mongol Tatars. The Serbian Tsardom to the south would have, however, capitulated. Dividing itself between ethnic lines, there would have been a new Epirus, Greek state, an Albanian state, and most interestingly for this scenario, a Bulgarian state, comprised of what is known as the Bogomils, a heresy in Christianity. They believed that Satan and God were equal, and this religion was mostly around Macedonia. In this timeline, Macedonia would be the last place where Slavic Bulgarians would exist, with the majority of the Slavic Bulgarians in Asia, Scythia Minor, being enslaved or subjugated by the Magyars. The Bogomils' national identity would be very heavily based on this religion, and although they would be seen as heretics by the rest of Europe, they would serve as a cornerstone in resisting Ottoman expansion, at least for the time being. However, despite their best efforts, and even though they would be able to resist the Ottomans for a few decades, by the late 1400s the Ottomans would have vassalized them, the Albanians and Epirus, establishing a coastline on the Adriatic Sea. The Bogolist Principality there would become one of the most dangerous to the Ottomans. They would begin to adopt gunpowder from Slovakia, as they would fight along in the forest. This would be some of the earliest guerrilla tactics in human history. However, it won't be enough, and the Ottomans would eventually convert the Bogomils from their heresy into Islam, eventually conquering them by pillaging their capital of Skopje. The Bogomils, however, would be briefly allowed to keep their principality. The Hungarian Tsardom would be conquered with the help of the Bogomils, with the Battle of Serdica being the deciding factor. The majority of what would be left of the Magyar realm would be around the old Bulgarian capital of Preslav, now likely renamed to something like Gaza. However, in the north, the Tsardom of Slovakia would be able to reaffirm its power over the Gorica Principality. After almost 200 years of independence, the Gorica Principality would have rejoined Slovakia, with a brief war then occurring against Poland, where they would annex the city of Krakow and force the Polish government to adopt the Tsarist style, alongside with the Cyrillic alphabet. It would be then through that influence that the Tsardom over Russia would also adopt the title of Tsar and the Cyrillic alphabet, now most of Eastern Europe utilizing the title. As the principalities of Bogomilia and Albania would be conquered, the Habsburg Austrian Empire would have come into contact with Slovakia, where the two of them would form an alliance. Working alongside with Poland and Lithuania, their alliance would be cut short. The battles of Vidin and the Battle of Skopje would be some of the most decisive. During the Battle of Skopje, the heir of the Austrian throne would be killed and the rest of his family would be captured, allowing for Slovakia to snatch their Bohemian holdings, including Silesia. This would have been the start and the formation of an early Czechoslovak realm, one which would have become an electorate in the Holy German Empire. Czechoslovakia would then be able to repel any Ottoman advancements towards them, with them making it their main goal to liberate the Slavs now under Ottoman control. Throughout this time, however, Czechoslovakia, unlike Austria and the Ottomans, would fail to modernize, being more akin to Russia. Despite this, through another holy war, Czechoslovakia would be able to take some of the Ottomans' coastline on the Adriatic. Czechoslovakia would then participate in the splitting of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, it wouldn't really gain much ground from it. More importantly, however, for Czechoslovakia, this would establish a good relation with the Russian Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia. Whereas Austria wouldn't have the opportunity to conquer Hungary and Slovakia and the Pannonian Basin, it would have focused on unifying Germany instead, which would have successfully done by this point. The disillusioned Holy German States would have been united by Herman Vukupal, a brilliant Silesian Czech general, originally serving as a military general in the partition of Poland, Lithuania. Vukupal would establish a new German republic upon the principles of democracy. Seeing first-hand tragedy and the suffering of the average Austrian and European soldier, he wanted to establish a new truly democratic nation, one in which the average peasant would be able to live a much better life and have the right to vote for a local electoral official who would have taken care of their own problems. Vukupal, however, would interestingly find allies in Prussia and Czechoslovakia. The Tsar of Czechoslovakia would personally invite him to help him take care of the unrest that was going around the country. Due to the lack of development within the country, corruption and poor investments, the Tsar of Czechoslovakia had struggled to keep the peasants at bay, with many of them taking up arms and their own guns, with many of them being from the Czechoslovak military, rebelling and establishing their own bandit communes. And so it would be Vukupal who would have established the Czechoslovak Duma, which would have helped with the stabilization of the country. Establishing voting rights and being essential for the modernization of Czechoslovakia into a more of a constitutional monarchy. Vukupal would also heavily help the French monarchy pay their debts. As such, many of the European leaders would listen to him, at least for the time being. Many European leaders would agree to establish at least some kind of representation for the average peasant. Now that technology was getting better, indeed the average peasant could become armed. Vukupal, unlike Napoleon, would successfully evade any major conflict over the European continent. The German Republic would have instead stabilized and had successfully started to spread the ideas of democracy across the European continent. Throughout the late 1800s, finally, a Russo-Turkish war would have resulted in the freeing of multiple states, including Serbia, a new Magyar state, and Romania, with the Russian Empire vassalizing the majority of them and desiring to use the Magyars to reach Constantinople. In this timeline, there were no Magyars living in Macedonia, and as such the Magyars had no desire to take that territory. This would set up the stage for a new major European war throughout the 1900s, as the Prussians will find themselves allied with Russia and its own allies, Great Britain and Italy, against Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Ottomans. The Russian Empire had decided to spread the idea of the God-given divine monarch further into Europe, feeling that its own monarchy would be threatened by the revolutionary ideas of the German Republic, while on the other hand Czechoslovakia had become increasingly more democratic, with the Duma Parliament having more power than the Tsar. They desired to protect themselves from Russian monarchism. The Ottoman Empire, on the other hand, would mostly join to regain its Balkan territories. Nonetheless, the war would start, and similarly to in real life, Czechoslovak soldiers would have fought in the Russian Far East. Although in this timeline the German Republic wouldn't be able to occupy Prussia like in ours, it would mainly be Czechoslovakia and the Ottoman Empire fighting against the Russians. Czechoslovakia, however, made it only as far as Kiev until they would be pushed back, and the Russian army would have entered through the Carpathian, capturing the city of Buda. The situation would become even worse when the Italians, who now controlled the Dalmatian coastline, would have entered further inland, helping the Serbian military in the liberation of Bosnia and Croatia, with the Romanians also entering through the Carpathians during the Gorica Principality, with the help of the Turkic people that still lived in the area. Czechoslovakia would practically be left completely on its own, causing what only can be described as a national disaster for the entire country, with the Germans not being able to reach into Prussia, the Ottomans never really having a stake in the war and them losing most of the Balkans incredibly early. Czechoslovakia would be left divided into Czechia and Slovakia, the majority of its territory stripped, and Gorica Principality given to Romania. The whole of Eastern Europe would then find itself under the grip of the Russian Empire, who, despite fighting in this war, would still find itself increasingly becoming more democratic due to the previous influence spread by Germany, but also because people were becoming increasingly more educated. Although life in Slovakia, Czechia, the newly formed Yugoslavia, Romania, the Magyar realm, and later what would become Bohemia, would become increasingly worsened, the states would struggle to industrialize and would be forced to wait in lines for simple supplies like bread. The previous mostly democratic institution of Czechoslovakia, the Duma, which had mostly industrialized the nation, would have now become a part of the Russian Empire. Slowly but surely, as the Russian Empire would begin to industrialize and democratize, they would begin to lose control of Eastern Europe. It would be around the 1950s, in fact, where things would begin to become looser and looser, with the Russian Empire reforming itself into a constitutional monarchy fully and focusing on developing these areas in order for it not to collapse. However, instead of having them as vassals, a new union would have been established, offensive and economic pact between them and the various countries. However, voting in Ruthenia in Ukraine would eventually result in the Russians being pushed back. Although in this timeline they would not lose the stand countries in Central Asia, they would still lose the majority of Eastern Europe to these independence movements, with eventually the European Federation sweeping in the area and establishing control over the various nations. Throughout the 1970s and the 80s, these nations